The Paul Leslie Hour, helping people tell their stories. And now, your host, Paul Leslie.
Hey, it's me. Hello and welcome to the Paul Leslie Hour. Thank you for tuning in. Before we get into the interview, I would be honored if you would consider going to thepaulleslie.com and clicking Support the Show. There are quite a number of things I want to accomplish with the Paul Leslie Hour, and you can help me get more of these interviews out there to the masses. It only takes a moment, and it makes a world of difference. Last but not least, tell someone about the Paul Leslie Hour. Let them know in whatever way you can. And now let's get into the interview.
Hello.
Hey, is this Bill LaBounty?
It sure is. Is this Paul?
It sure is. How you doing?
I'm good.
That's good to hear. So how are things up in Nashville?
Things are springing right along. Getting really pretty days. It's a little overcast today, but it's pretty warm. It's nice. Blossoming.
It's not bad, I can tell you that. It's a beautiful day. I've been looking forward to talking to you for a long time, so I really appreciate you making the time to do it.
Sure. I love discussing myself. Especially with people like you that usually shine a positive light on me, as opposed to my wife or somebody like that.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce you to the voice that you hear there. That's Bill LaBounty. He's here with us. He's a diverse artist, both in terms of his abilities, but also his styles of writing. He is a performing and recording artist. His most recent album, I would call it kind of a bluesy R&B affair. It's called Into Something Blue, and it features not only his own material, but also songs written by the likes of Ray Charles, The Drifters, Bob Dylan. Bill LaBounty is a keyboardist and synthesist, and he's worked in the studio with everyone from James Taylor to Patti LaBelle. And as a songwriter, his work has been recorded by a great number of artists: Steve Wariner, Brooks and Dunn, Ronnie Milsap, a duet of Tanya Tucker with Delbert McClinton, Gino Vannelli, Jimmy Buffett, Steve Goodman, Waylon Jennings, to name but a few. In fact, there have been more than 100 songs of his that have been recorded by other artists. He's performed in the U.S., France, Japan. It's a great pleasure to have Bill LaBounty with us.
Hey, thanks, Paul, and thanks to whoever may be listening. There were no lies in that last statement you made, so that's good. There were, at least I don't think there are any lies, no.
Well, Bill, could you say what it is in music that gives you the most joy?
Boy, I've thought about that before, and I think the most joyful thing about music is it's one of the few things in life that you can't really appreciate, create, or listen to without being in the present, in the moment. And generally, when you're in the moment, you're pretty happy. I think, generally, sometimes we're in the moment in a horrible way, but normally, being in the moment's nice. You can't follow a rhythm. You can't dance along the top of a melody, all of that stuff. You just kind of have to be zoned right in on the time that you happen to be standing in. So that's a nice thing about music. And the other thing is, for me, it's something that's run in my family for many, many years, generations, and passed down to various members of the family. And I was one that was lucky enough to find my place in it. I had two aunts who were both piano players. Well, they were great aunts. My grandmother and two other aunts were old ragtime style piano players. And when I was a little boy, I would sit on their laps while they played and put my arms over their arms and they're kind of doing that left-handed ragtime, little finger on the bass, hand on the chord, and then the melody with the right hand. And when they would finish, I would assume that same position and move my hands back and forth, move my right arm the same way. And of course, it was all gobbledygook, but it was the right rhythm. And so sometimes you'd play something randomly that actually sounded good, and my aunts would go, "Oh, Billy, that is so beautiful." And, oh boy, that sent me on my way.
And the area of the country you're from the Pacific Northwest, is that true?
I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. Yeah, I was born in Wisconsin. Oh. And when I was very young, about 7 years old, my family moved to Oregon, and I started grade school and pretty much grew up there. I graduated high school, continued living there and making music. So when I think of my childhood, I usually think of that little town in eastern Oregon where I grew up and where I really started generally professionally playing music as a kid. And I went back to Wisconsin from time to time because, like I say, that's where there were musicians in my family. I had uncles who played, and I, of course, having been born there and having all those relatives, I would go back frequently and visit Christmases and holidays. So I guess I'm a northern boy, which I saw the New York on your call. I take it you are familiar with the East Coast.
Yes, sir. I sure am.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what kind of last name is LaBounty? What ancestry is that?
It's Canuck.
Ah.
Or Canuck. It's Canadian, French Canadian. It's kind of like the northern version of a Cajun. And on my father's side, my grandfathers and great-grandfathers, who I never really met. I remember my grandfather they called them frogs up there because for some reason a lot of Canucks have big freckles. I was born with a lot of freckles, so a lot of them would get the nickname frog, but they were all trappers and bear trappers. And I remember I asked my grandpa once where he lived when he was a little boy, and he said, "I lived in this coat." He had a big fur coat on. And basically, yeah, I mean, he probably did, and certainly his father, they just lived in the woods, and they lived off the fat of the land. And living up there, it wasn't really very fat, so they probably scuffled around quite a bit. But so that's French Canadian. But I've been to France, and when I go to Paris, I've told people that I'm French, and they say, "No, you're not. You're Canadian." So I guess there was a difference, even though I had a French name.
Interesting. When did you start to realize that you had this ability that not only could you play someone else's music, but you could create melodies and things of yourself?
As I'm sure a lot of baby boomers at that time, like me, successful and mid-successful, realized if they were going to try to pursue rock and roll, which is what we played in the early 60s to the late 60s, if they really wanted to make records, that was it. If you wanted to make records, you couldn't just record somebody else's song in order to make a splash of some kind. You had to write something. You had to create your own. And so really that was the only time it ever occurred to me, the first time it occurred to me that I needed to create music and create words. And also I had a friend who at the time, I think his name was Butch. He was 26. And he was much older than I was because I was like 15, 16, 17 when I met him. And he was a guitar player, and he was a songwriter. He actually sort of identified, which back in 64, 65, 66, you didn't meet many people that said, I'm a songwriter. And so I would listen to him and I was with him a lot when I was a kid because the first band I was in was with him and a bunch of older guys. And I would listen to him go through the process of putting songs together. He was actually a pretty good songwriter. He died early. But I remember, and he worshipped the artists he really worshipped were country artists at the time. Merle Haggard, Waylon Jennings, and, who else wrote a lot of stuff back then. But I remember he would say, I want to go to Nashville and I want to get a songwriter deal at Tree Publishing, because that's where all the really great songwriters are. That made an impression on me as a kid, because that was something that wasn't common knowledge in the Pacific Northwest among kids who were trying to learn Beatles songs. And eventually the Beatles came along, 65 or 66. So that was pretty inspirational. And the fact that at a certain point, I had bands that were doing well regionally, but of course everybody's goal was, we used to call it make it. We're going to make it. And so I thought, well, I'll write some songs. I said it. Remember, I wrote on a clavinet. I had a Wurlitzer piano, a Hammond organ, and a clavinet. And for some reason, I like to write the songs. A lot of older songwriters like me, keyboard players, wrote on Whirly, which I did too. But for some reason, I wish I had that clavinet now. I'll bet it would be very vintage, and it'd probably be worth a lot of money.
Who would you say are the songwriters that would probably have made the biggest influence on you?
Bob Dylan, for sure.
Yeah.
I started listening to his music. What was the name of the album? Freewheelin'.
Yeah.
Bob Dylan. And it had, I'm trying to remember this, the one that had like 19 verses that about, there's hard rain's going to fall. I would listen to that over and over again. And at the time, that was like, to me, that was the 60s song. And I would ask, and I was so impressed, and I would ask my mother to listen, and she just didn't get it, and it was a generational thing then. And I would ask my father to listen, who was a World War II vet and stuff, and it would just piss him off. I had to like stand in front of the record player to keep him from coming and throwing it off the record. And that to me was impressive, because I thought, wow, if he must really be saying something if even my parents don't get it, And then when I think I was a junior in high school, Like a Rolling Stone, which was his very first radio hit, came out. And I remember they would play I think it was a 6-minute long cut on the radio. And that just blew me away. You didn't hear things like that. Up until then, I wasn't even hip to the really great black R&B artists. As a kid, I listened to the Beach Boys and then the Beatles, and the only way I found out about James Brown and Ray Charles and all of those people were through my older friends, like this Butch that I talked about. I'd play him a Beach Boys song, and he'd say, you should hear Chuck Berry do that song if you want to hear something great. And so I listened to Chuck Berry, and I thought, he's right. Same with the Isley Brothers. The Beatles did Twist and Shout. He said, you should listen to the Isley Brothers do that. And that's how I got into R&B and all of that stuff. And I imagine that was the same for a lot of USA kids at that time. Although in the Pacific Northwest, we were kind of stranded up there in the trees in the north, and we didn't have access. Like if you grew up in the South, I imagine it would have been different for people who would not only have access to it, but like Elvis would be walking around hand in hand with listening to it, So, and back then it was such a different music business because it was regional. If you lived in the Pacific Northwest, you had your own style everything from music to the way you walked and stuff. I mean, they sold different things on billboards than they did if you went south and went down into Northern California. That was a whole other different world. It was like places were like different planets musically, and I sort of miss that, don't you? The variety of culture, from state to state. Now we're lucky if we find it from country to country, But back then it was, to be a kid, and we had a 1946 Cadillac hearse that we put all our gear in, and we go from town to town. You felt like you were Christopher Columbus or something, You go from Eastern Oregon all the way up to Portland, Oregon, and play. Go to Seattle. When I was a kid, we ditched school and went to Portland to hear the Beatles.
Oh, wow.
And that was a real inspirational thing for me because, well, the hysterics that went on. I think it was called the Paramount Theater where they played in Portland, and the power went out at some point. Or the power went out, and so the PA shut down and everything, and it was maybe the last half hour of the concert, and they did the rest of their set acoustically screaming, I guess Ringo was jumping up and down, making the backbeat, and you couldn't hear him. You could barely hear him. And that was impressive to me. That was wild. But I don't know how songwritery this conversation is.
No, it's cool, though.
I'm getting kind of nostalgic, I guess. Oh, good.
I'm curious about what was going through your head when you decided to go to Nashville. What were you feeling when and what led you to believe, you know what, I'm going to head down to Tennessee?
I lived in LA for years. The first place where you went back then, like in the Pacific Northwest, to make it was LA. And on the way to LA, depending on which route you took, the common one, you go through Vegas. And so really the first taste of that kind of music business was Vegas for me. And a lot of rock bands, this was like 68, 69, were getting gigs in Vegas. And there was a place, of course, called the A-Go-Go. It was the only rock joint in Vegas, and it was on the Strip. And at that time, there wasn't too much yet on the Strip. But this was if you had a rock band, you could play at the A-Go-Go. And as opposed to a showroom, where you'd have to learn everybody else's hits and all of that. So we went to Vegas, and then from Vegas, not far to LA. And we ended up, what we did first in LA was you could go into a place like Gold Star or Sun West Studios on Sunset. You could rent the studio and record in there. Sometimes if you even sidemen. Of course, we had a band. We didn't need to do that, but that was back at the time when there were people like Glenn Campbell and Leon Russell walking around doing sessions, and not my sessions, but doing sessions. So we'd go in Sun West and cut maybe 4 sides, which would be like 245s. And then we'd take the masters back up to Oregon or Boise, Idaho, which was sort of our headquarters then, and press them. And then that was at a time when you could take them to a station and they'd just start playing them, if they liked them. And so that's like instant fame in your little pond. Didn't really need to go to LA and stay, but we ended up going to LA with a band. We had a band called Fat Chance, and it was a horn band, and it was at the time when Blood, Sweat, and Tears and Chicago and all that stuff was happening. And we played Hoot Night at the Troubadour. And I remember that was a great night, and there were label people there and handing us their cards and stuff. And we ended up getting a record deal on RCA. So then you had to stay in LA. You couldn't go running. I remember a couple of guys still wanted to go back up for their girlfriends were graduating. They wanted to go to the prom or something like that. So I lived in LA, and I made my own records. I found a producer I worked with. It was the real old school time when people like Artie Ripp and these New York guys. That was back when a songwriter, you didn't really know what publishing was. You got performances, and your producer sort of shoddily explained to you what the publishing business consisted of, not telling you that you were getting whatever the hell he decided you could get, you know. And those were the best deals. They weren't like, that was the best you could do. It took years to realize that much of the music business, what publishing really meant. And of course, it's come to mean a hell of a lot more now than it did back then. But anyway, I lived in LA from 68, 67 through 1982.
Oh, okay.
So that was a few years, and did my own records. I was on RCA first, and then I did some sides on Capitol, and then finally I went to Warner Brothers and made a couple records, and then I lost my Warner's deal back when we called it the Great Disco Wars, when disco music was really hot, and I wasn't really that into it. And plus, music was changing. They were signing punk bands, and they called it new wave music. And I was on Warner's when Bonnie Raitt was there, and one day they just purged. Everybody lost their deal, and I remember sitting around with a bunch of people, and Bonnie was there, and somebody said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And I don't know. I'm going to go back up to Oregon and work for the highway department or something. And somebody went to Bonnie, and she said, "They said, what are you going to do?" And she said, "I'm going to play the blank and blues. That's what I do. I play the blues." And I remember thinking, yeah, well, good luck with that, you know. That, but in a way, and another year later, I moved to Nashville, which I may have never done, except I met my wife here on a trip here, and we fell in love. And she was a songwriter, Becky Foster. And it wasn't long before I'd been in Nashville for maybe a year and a half. I was on Screen Gems music, and somebody said, "Bonnie Raitt's going to be here today listening to songs. Do you have anything you could play for her?" She came in with, who is that great producer that did that first album with I Can't Make You Love Me on it? He was a bass player, I remember. I can't think of his name now, but anyways, she came in with him. Who?
Was it Dunn was?
Dunn was, exactly, yes. And I didn't get a cut, but I sure wanted to. And I remember saying, "Well, what kind of stuff are you doing? Is she doing?" They said, "Blues." And I didn't say good luck then, because by that time it was sort of anything goes. It was getting into the 80s in the music business. And I knew Don was a cool guy, because he'd been on it. He had been out that he did with his brother. But the people that did get songs on that album were lucky and good, I'm sure. So anyway, I moved to Nashville in 1983. I lost my deal on Warner's, and I used to tell people, if I lose my deal, I'm going to just go back up to Oregon and work for the highway department, because I thought that would be nice to work in the Pacific Northwest outdoors, and I thought my back's still good. Little did I know what was going to happen to my back after years of hauling a Hammond organ around. But no, I came down here, and I loved Nashville from the first time I got here. It was it was definitely a music town, but it was a whole different ball game than Los Angeles. I mean, there was a sort of a traditional net for people who were in the music business here, who were seriously either as a songwriter or a singer, artist, even session players. And when one person won, everybody won. It was just this little community of people. And it wasn't that way in LA, which is probably good, because you don't get to be a hardened professional, independent artist without having some competitive things going on. In New York and LA were like that. Like, I remember telling people at the time, if I went into, why Nashville was different, and I said, well, if I went in to get a deal in LA and auditioned somewhere and played my songs and they sounded just like Sting, I would probably be told, you sound exactly like Sting, you sound like Sting, so you need to develop your own thing. Whereas in Nashville, if you sound like Johnny Cash or any of the classic country, it was a tradition of sound that you work. That was part of the whole medium. You work in that, and it's still that way, at least for the great artists. And I liked that. I guess I was tired of competing on that level. I always wanted to be a recording artist, but mostly I just loved music. And when I first got here in Nashville, I just sat and I pretended like I still had a record deal and I was making my next album. And at that time, that window of fashion and the music business was open. So I was getting a lot of cuts, and I didn't realize those windows only stay open for a fleeting amount of time. And then you have to either, become a professional songwriter, quote unquote, or stay an artist. And there's not too much difference, but you have to cave to a few professional aspects of what a songwriter is. And it's a fun cave. It's a fun way to compete, to think this person's looking for a song. They're doing this album. If I were them, what would I want to sing? So you can sort of stay an artist in your head regardless. But you do have, if you want to be a popular songwriter, you have to be on top of everything. I remember that, and I'm really not anymore. And I haven't been for a while, but you have to go down and you have to read Billboard and all of the trades. You have to see not just who's recording, but who's producing the record, who might be publishing it that things like that. And when you stay on top of all that, you have a better chance of getting who to rub elbows with, sort of. And that's the only problem, I think, with probably, and it may still be that way with, living in Pocatello and something with your band in a box or whatever. You really have to be here. You have to be in your music town to make it happen, I think. That, at least from a professional standpoint, from a music business standpoint. But Becky and I together started getting a lot of records because she was a background singer who knew everybody. She'd sung on all their records for years. So she introduced me. That was luck, and besides the fact that I fell in love with her instantly, and I hope the feeling was mutual. So if I finished something, like I remember I got here and I was kind of pop sounding, and she said, that's not country, that's pop. And I'd say, I know, but I've been listening to the radio, and there's this guy, Steve Wariner, who it's not pop, but he's really sophisticated in his approach to melody, and I really like the way he sings. And she said, oh, I know him. I know how to get in touch with Steve. And so she and I had just written this song called The Weekend, and she called Steve. Also, she called Steve, I think, because we had a very good friend who had just moved here named Randy Hart, and he had just been working as a keyboard player with Roger Miller. And when he got here, Roger no longer returned his calls, so Becky said, I'll call Steve and see if he needs, because Steve needed a keyboard player. So when Randy went on his first gig with Steve, he had The Weekend in his pocket, the song that Becky and I had written. And that was kind of typical of what happened from then on, because at that time, that window of Nashville had all the people in it that it was a generation, I think. I tell people that my first session in Nashville, one of the first people I wrote with here was Don Cook. And we became fast friends, and we wrote a bunch of songs. At that time, Don was a songwriter at Tree. He took me down to Tree. I finally got to see Tree after those years of my friend Butch telling me about it. And I loved that atmosphere and all the tradition, all the pictures on the wall of these incredible writers. But anyway, Don and I recorded our very first songs that we'd written together there. And I tell people that at that time, the guys that were on my session were Don, who went on to be a pretty well-known producer. Paul Worley played guitar. Tony Brown came in because he was buddies with Paul and Don. And it was kind of like a generation of guys that had sort of the same age and were sort of going for the same things. I wasn't really. I wasn't as ambitious as those guys. Those guys did really well. They were already talking about making. They wanted to make records. And if you want to be a good producer, a successful producer, you just have to love making records. It almost doesn't matter which record you make. You just so you're doing it. It's kind of like music, And of course, it's a lot like music because most of the great producers here were musicians and benefited from that too. But anyway, Nashville has been my home since 1980. The summer of '83 was when I met Becky. And she had a #1 hit on the charts at the time that I met her. And I remember we were standing around at some function and somebody had introduced me. My publisher introduced me to her. And like guys do, they were all sort of bragging about the song they'd just written and talking and trying to persuade everybody of their mastery of the music business. And Becky was just standing there really quietly the whole time. And then later we got a chance to talk a little more intimately. And she had the #1 song in town and everybody. And that's when I realized if you're a girl, especially at that time, any female, whether she could have been a producer, a hit songwriter, you're a chick singer, whether you're an artist, whatever. In Nashville, a girl was a chick singer. So Becky was a chick singer, even though she was doing everything I wanted to do. But anyway, that was one of the reasons I really dug her because she knew what she was. And we had a lot of success together. And it was, for me, it was just sort of a dream come true because I'd been through a bad marriage and I didn't think that I was going to ever be happily joined with anybody. I thought I would meet some nice girls, but we just really connected. So
was there ever any, you're close to somebody like you're close with her. Was there any kind of disagreement in terms of direction, like the creative direction of a song?
Yes. And it was usually her disagreeing with me when it happened. There wasn't a whole lot of that. But maybe I would come up with a lyric or a change that she wasn't impressed with. And she'd say, you should try this. And I'd never done anything like that. I wasn't really a collaborative songwriter when I got here. I was just learning how to do all that stuff. And I would get kind of grumpy and maybe get up and walk off and then come back and say, what is it you're talking about? And I'd try it and it was great. It would work out, so she taught me a lot there too. She really kind of taught me how to write collaboratively. She wasn't always right, but I would say over half the time she was right. And so I would switch things around and it was the way a collaborative process is supposed to work. So yeah. And then, I wrote with a lot of other people. It took me a long time to realize as a writer that not to approach the collaborative session like I was the evil genius, that was going to bring that was going to make something happen because I was whoever I thought I was. And because I realized early on, not early enough, but everybody's that way. Everybody comes to a collaborative writing session as the evil genius. And sometimes if you just help that person nursemaid their genius, you can end up with a hit. That's one of the things that separate a professional songwriter, I think, from just somebody who writes an artist songwriter. First of all, when you write for yourself, it has to be inspired or you won't like it and you won't finish it. But if you're writing for some recording entity, like Peter Cetera, whoever, Steve Wariner, then in one way it closes off sort of a certain kind of passion, but in another way it opens up a whole world that you might never have explored as an artist. And so, and if you do that for long enough, I went on to make my own records as time wore on. But if you do it all the time for too long, you lose that motivation to look down inside yourself for something because it takes confidence first. You do have to consider yourself an evil genius to really pull something out of yourself that's so you that nobody else could ever recognize it unless you convey it, with your brilliant keyboard playing or singing or whatever. You can forget that. You can forget how to. It's not like how to do it. You forget what motivates you to do it. And in my old age, I've kind of returned to. I'm an old evil genius now. No, I'm kidding, but you have to kind of return to that part of yourself. And I don't do a lot of collaborative writing. Becky and I write, and that's about it. And she still tells me when she doesn't care for something that I'm doing. And at this point, I find it valuable. I think I respond to her the same way I always did. I'm kind of grumpy, but then I say, well, now, what did she say? And that's kind of the way any successful collaboration is, I think.
The first time I became aware of you, the first time I remember reading the name Bill LaBounty, it's going on like 19 years ago, now that I think about it, but we're finally getting around to doing this interview. But I had become obsessed around my high school years with Steve Goodman.
Oh, gosh.
And I had this Steve Goodman anthology, and there's a song you wrote with him. I'm hoping you can tell us about writing with Steve Goodman. The song I'm talking about, Where's the Party?
Oh, yeah. Well, I could go on for days about Steve. He influenced my life, not so much as, music or anything else, just who Steve Goodman was. He was just this incredible character. And when you're hanging with him, at least I did, I knew I was with somebody special. I never got to know John Prine very well, but I imagine knowing Prine would be the same way, because they're just guys that he went deeper than just even a song. He always wanted to be great, and he was at what he wrote. But when I met Steve, I met him through his manager, Al Bonetta, who also managed John. But I had just written this song called Hot Rod Hearts that Al Bonetta took to Robbie Dupree's production people. And it was a hit. It was like a top 10 record in Cashbox and various places. And so I got to know those guys, and I got to know Al. In fact, Al was the one that would say, you should check out Nashville. You'd like Nashville. And I didn't think I thought like that would be like your second try at anything. But then he introduced me to Steve, and I remember I was just knocked out with Steve just as a person. And at first I thought he was like this over dramatic guy. I didn't realize anything about his illness, but I thought he was just sort of jiving me. Like he'd say things like, Pain is my sister. That was one of his. Pain is my sister. Something else is my brother, and something is my father. And I didn't really know what that meant until I found out about he had leukemia, and Steve worked. He was like one of those hardest working man in show business type guys, and he was on the road all the time. And he lived in Seal Beach, and at that time I lived in the mountains above San Bernardino in Lake Arrowhead. And Steve, when he would be off the road for a couple of years there, you know, he'd spend time with his family in Seal Beach, but then he'd come up there with me and stay at my house in Lake Arrowhead, which was like a rented house, but it was in a beautiful area. And we would write, and he would write. He wrote Don Cubman's Last Request sitting on the edge of my bed when I was trying to go to sleep at 3 a.m. And check out this, you know, and he'd wake me up. I'd say, go to bed, Steve. But then, you know, when I heard anything he did was brilliant, and it was a treat to hear it. But at 3 a.m. after you'd have like a bottle of scotch with him or something, it wasn't necessarily. But we wrote a lot of stuff together, but more than anything, I just loved the guy. I just loved being around him. And I wish he was still here. I wish John was still here. Had Steve lived, he would have been in Nashville, I'm sure. And, you know, probably at the top of anybody's game.
Can you remember what the circumstances were, or the inspiration maybe of that song, Where's the Party?
Where's the Party? I think it was a title we heard on TV or something. We sat down and it was he and I in Lake Arrowhead. And we got it to basically almost to a finished stage. What it needed was Jimmy Buffett. You know, we needed somebody like that who wouldn't want a Jimmy Buffett song? And Steve said, well, I know Buffett. He's a good friend of mine. He said, so I'm going to be in Florida such and such a date. And when I'm there, I'll get with Buffett. And if he likes it, can I finish it with him? And that's how that came about. Steve got with Buffett in Florida, and Buffett wrote a bridge. That was the name of that tune. And I was thrilled because we were on, it was Something in the World album that song came out on. I always hoped it would be a single, as you always do, but Where's the Party? It probably, most of the songs I did with Steve really reflected Steve more than me. And Steve would go ahead, if we disagreed on something, on a lyric, which we did fairly often, but it didn't matter. I mean, I remember we wrote one song, I Just Keep Falling in Love was the name of the song. And I wrote it in 4/4 time, and Steve wrote it in 3/4 time. And it would drive me crazy because I'd be playing through a verse and trying to get to the chorus, and Goodman's playing it in 3/4 time to my 4/4 time. I remember a friend came over and sat around while we were working and was laughing because we would both play, and it sounded like we were playing two very different songs. And I think Nicolette Larson cut it, and she may have done it in 3/4 time, and then somebody else did it, and it was 4/4 time. But a few people cut it. It was never like a giant smash or anything, but it was kind of typical of the way I worked with Goodman. He was just, you knew better. If Steve wanted to do something, he just did it. And I'd rather have that than somebody trying to get me to do something. Usually if he just did it, I just followed along with whatever he was doing.
What did you think of Jimmy Buffett's interpretation of that song?
I thought it was good. I imagine I would have enjoyed Steve's more, just because Steve, it identified to me with Steve that when he would play it and sing it. But I thought Buffett's was pretty cool.
Yeah, I have to say, Steve's version was better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's usually the case. You know, he was just a special guy. The first day that I met him, I was staying at Le Parc in Hollywood. So when I would drive down from Lake Arrowhead to work in LA, and I would stay at the park sometimes, especially if I had a label or a publisher who would pay for it for me. And I was introduced to Steve, and he came up to my room there, and I had my whirly there, and instantly I liked him. I didn't know whether we'd be able to write a song together, but I just liked hanging with him, and we loved writing together. But the first thing he did, if you can imagine this, he had just signed to Elektra Records, and he was working on his first project for Elektra. And as labels can do, some A&R person or something had been down to the session at the studio where he was working, and they didn't like the fact that he was putting steel guitar and mandolins on something. They wanted the record to be cool and hip, and they didn't think those kind of influence. They didn't think Steve should make that kind of country folky record. But anyway, he had complained to me about that, and after we got finished working, we went and ate after. But he said, "Hey, I've got a meeting at Elektra. Why don't you come with me?" And I thought, I was on Warner's then, and I thought, why on earth would you want to bring anybody to a business meeting at your record label? I mean, I used to stay awake for nights worrying, having anxiety about meetings at my record label. I was with Warner's then, and I'd have meetings in Burbank, and I'd have to play and stuff, and they would tell me they were trying to give you direction. And I don't know if I don't think that even goes on anymore. But so we go down to Elektra, and I'll never forget this because I didn't know Steve very well, and I was just totally stunned that he wanted me to go with him. And I didn't want to go with him, and he had to cajole me to go with him. So we go to this guy's office. I can't remember his name. I probably shouldn't repeat his name, but he starts. His name was Bob. I can't remember his last name, but I say his first name because it's sort of part of the story. Because he starts lecturing Steve about pop music and had records and what he wants to do with him, and Steve goes, "Bob, where did you grow up?" And Bob goes, "Long Island." Steve goes, "Oh, yeah." And he goes back to talking. Steve says, "Bob, have you ever taken a risk in your whole life about anything?" I'm sitting there thinking, holy shit, and Bob, took it the way I would expect anybody to take it, as an insult, He says, "Hell yes, I've taken risks." And Steve says, "Oh, okay." He says, "Because I take risks. All artists, recording artists do take a risk. That's all we do. And if I don't have a record label to take my risks with me, then I don't have a record label." And I'm thinking, why am I here? Jesus. But anyway, that's how the meeting went. Then we left, and Steve said, "He's an SOB." And I thought, yeah, but and he didn't care. I mean, he just did not care. The guy could have said, "Get out of here and never come back. We're not going to do your record." Of course, they didn't, because, Steve cared. Even at that time, he was sort of iconic. I just thought, I really have to get to know this guy. I mean, I can't believe this. But that was just a typical day for Steve. Have you ever taken a risk in your life? I couldn't believe that. And it's something that you've always wanted to say, in those kind of circumstances.
That's great. Well, Bill, can you tell us, who was the first person ever that cut one of your songs, your very first interpretation that someone made?
My very first cut was probably 1976, maybe 75, even earlier. And it was when I first moved from Oregon to Lake Arrowhead. And I had a producer, publisher, manager, one of those old school New York type deals where the guy just runs everything and then he pays you what he thinks. But anyway, I had And I wasn't near LA. And in fact, he wanted me up there, so I was kind of isolated. He didn't want me running around LA, you know, getting him in trouble or weakening whatever he thought he could get. But anyway, I lived in this house in this place called Sky Forest. Beautiful, beautiful place. It was like 7,000 feet up in the Lake Arrowhead Mountains. And down the street from me was where this guy, Gene McDaniels, lived. I don't know if you know Gene McDaniels' name, but when he was a kid, he recorded 100 Pounds of Clay. Do you remember that record? He took 100. But at that time, he had a hit R&B record on, I can't think of her name. Feel like making love. That was the name.
Roberta Flack.
On this great Roberta Flack. He was producing Roberta Flack. And he somehow, I think I went over to his house it had nothing to do with my manager or my publisher, and I met him, and I had this song. He had a piano there in his living room, and I played it for him. It was called Room 205. And he loved that song. And it was in 3/4 time now that I think about it. And he was just bringing her into the studio, Mary Clayton. He said, Mary would love this, man. He said, it sounds kind of churchy because it's in 3/4 time. And, you know, like a lot of people, I knew her by name. It was one of those names you just knew. And what I didn't realize is I knew her because I knew her name because she's the one that had just sung on that Rolling Stone record, Just a Shot Away. And she like shouted out the intro, Just a Shot Away. She was a very well-known background singer. She sang with the Raylettes for years. She was the one singing background on That's What I Say. She would answer Ray. But anyway, that was my first song. He brought that song to her, and that was luck for me because it wasn't so much it was a hit song. It was just like a record that to this day, I just love the way it turned out. And that doesn't really happen all that often if you're trying to make a living writing songs. But that particular record, I think you can find it still on YouTube. Stuff was called Room 205. And Gene came by my house one day and took me out to his car where he had a great stereo, and he sat and played it for me, and I was just knocked my shoes off. Mary Clayton. And then after that, I think I met Bob Gaudio and Frankie Valli through my publisher, manager, producer. And Frankie did a couple of my songs. So that was probably the second on the list of something happening with my songs. But I had a record deal at this time. I was I was probably working on my second album when I met Frankie, and so most of the songs I'd written were just things to sing for. I was on Warner Brothers then, and the nice thing about if I ever gave somebody advice who was young, because now there's sort of this cult of songwriter where a lot of young people say, "Well, I want to be a hit songwriter." Really, if you want to do well in this business, I wouldn't ever introduce myself if I was young as a songwriter. I would introduce myself as an artist and do it in a way that's kind of passionate and conceited, because that's what's going to, even if you're not, if you can pull it off. I'm saying that like I did it, but I never did do that. But if you're a recording artist, that's the best promo you could ever get as a songwriter. And the really successful recording artists, of course, could care less whether they were ever promoted as a songwriter. But people want to hear your heart, you know, and the whole idea of songwriter a lot of times is not about your heart. It's about scoring and getting a hit and having a hook and which all has its value. But when you're young, you should want to be an artist. I guess that's my general advice. And of course, an artist who sings his own songs. Singer-songwriter. I guess that term came into being around, that was the end of the 60s when we started hearing from James Taylor and stuff. Neil Diamond was the first real singer-songwriter.
You might be the only person on Earth who has had both a Buffett cut and a Gino Vannelli cut.
Yeah.
Can you remember working with Gino Vannelli?
Sure. I had a place. Becky and I used to keep a place here, our house, and then we would rent a place in Malibu, and we would drive out to L.A. We would spend the summers in L.A. and the winters here. And I met Gino in Malibu. There was a restaurant called El Coyote in Malibu. There's one in Hollywood too. But I think the first one was in Malibu, and it was way out almost to where Cane Doom is. And you would see, Johnny Carson might come in to pick up some burritos there or something. And that's how Malibu was back then. Dylan lived out there. But anyway, I was out there, and I was eating with my collaborator that day who knew Gino. So when Gino came in, he introduced me. And I'm trying to, I can't even, you know what? I can't remember our title, the title that we wrote, but.
Be Total Stranger.
I was very impressed with him as an artist. I mean, he's a perfect example of somebody who is passionate about what they sing. The one thing that stands out about meeting Gino and going to his house to write is I got out of my car and started walking to the front door, and as I was walking, this giant Irish wolfhound started galloping toward me, barking. I mean, it was one of those, I don't know if you've seen like the healthy, full-grown Irish wolfhounds, but they're like the size of a pony or something.
Yeah.
And he came bounding up to me, and I thought, holy shit, he's just going to eat me here. And by that time, Gino was out, and he says, he won't hurt you. And I thought, oh. And he bounded up. He put his paws on both my shoulders and knocked me down. Once he had me down, he just started licking my face like he was a puppy dog, basically. That was his way of saying hi to somebody that came. So I remembered that. And I always remembered that Irish wolfhounds are really, even though they look horrible and horribly ferocious, they're not like a pit bull or even a German shepherd. They're really friendly dogs. But anyway, Gino was working on his album, and he worked with his brother then. And he had this really decked out, he had a home studio with everything in it that you needed back then. You don't need anything now but a Pro Tools box and a keyboard. But back then, he had all the stuff. His brother played drums too, I think. And he was working on that album, I think, that Total Stranger was on.
It might be a difficult question, but of all the different cuts you've gotten, has somebody done a best version of something you wrote? Like the best interpretation of a Bill LaBounty song?
I think Steve Wariner's version of The Weekend with Tony Brown producing. And Tony, especially back then, he's pretty much a purist. He loves country. He knows what it means. He knows where it comes from. He knows where he wants it to go. And I played, at that time, Jimmy Bowen still lived here. And I first played the song for Jimmy Bowen. And Bowen wanted to cut it on Steve. And I think both Bowen and Tony produced on that album that The Weekend was on. But, I'd been in the studio one other time with somebody. I won't say their name who was going to do the song. I hadn't lived here that long. And when I demoed the song, I used all my little digital toys the DX7 and all this stuff that you could get back then, and to sort of make things. At that time, it stood out in Nashville. It didn't take long before everybody was in that world. But I had an arpeggiator that went boop, 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 boop for the background of it and all these different things. And when I played the song for Tony, I played. My memory's coming back, but Tony heard it before Steve did, and Tony just said, "That's pop. We don't do pop here, LaBounty. That's it. Go take it back to L.A. Take it to Christopher Cross," which is who Becky and I had in mind when we were writing it. And he said, "I don't do that." So then Steve got a hold of it, and Steve had enough pull in his career that he was going to do the song, by God, no matter what. And Tony was doing sides on him then. And I thought, oh, he's going to do it with Tony. What's going to happen? And one day I got a call from Tony, and he said, "LaBounty, can you just come over here and do what you did with the demo?" He said, "We're just going to make your demo." And I thought, and that's not why I always thought it was the greatest cut that I've ever had. It was really due to Tony's taste and ears, because I never would have produced a record that sounded at that time, it sounded really great to me. It had all the organic stuff that you want in a country, sort of a country feel, but it also had all the ideas that I liked, And to this day, I think, when I hear it, I think Tony really made that record sound great. And of course, Steve always does. He's playing and singing. So I'd have to say that record, just from the standpoint of something that I just like the way it sounds, it would be that. The Mary Clayton record stands out because it was the first recording I ever had, and to this day, that one still sounds good too, to me.
Well, today I went to the dentist, and the dentist was kind enough. I was listening as he was going to work. I was listening to your album, Into Something Blue. And
yeah,
it's a really great album, and I'm hoping you can tell us about that title cut.
Into Something Blue. That song also it goes back quite a ways, and I had some real close possibilities. I mean, it was actually, my mind is, who is the artist that did She's Crazy About the Boy? He's crazy about the girl.
She's crazy about the girl.
And she married, oh man. Anyway, it had been recorded.
You're not talking about Trisha Yearwood.
Trisha Yearwood had cut it. And then what I heard from the session players who were on the session is they went out for dinner, and when they came back, she was supposed to sing it, and she just couldn't get into it. So it just kind of sat in the can on her. And so nothing had really happened with it. But it's a song that I really love doing. I do it much better now than I did when it was on that album, but it has Larry on it. So having Carlton play some of his wonderful guitar puts it in a different category. But it was a song that I wrote with Sam Lorber, who is an old friend and collaborator. And when we wrote it, Into Something Blue, we both thought of it as a female song, she's going to go and change, but then realized later that, that it can be translated by a guy or a girl. In fact, Bill Medley then, much later, did his version of it on an album that he cut with Steve Dorff. And it's fantastic. Steve Dorff loves to gussy things up, and I say gussy, but he does it in a really big, beautiful way, always with string arrangements, and he did the whole thing with Bill. So it's just about, and I still do the song live when I perform, or when I used to perform before this whole pandemic thing. It was one that always went over real well. That I do.
Tell me about getting Larry Carlton to play on this record.
Well, Larry and I go way back. We knew each other way back in the late 60s, early 70s. And he was basically a session player then, although Larry was the first session player that was notable enough that he built a studio in his house, and he didn't go out anymore to do dates. to overdub. Everything had to come to his house. So if you wanted him on your record, you had to send over the master, and he would do it all by himself. And you just got, if you didn't like it, he didn't care. Because also Larry is one of the few instrumentalists and really notable session players to really consider themselves an artist, and he wanted to make records, and he wanted to define himself as an instrumentalist. We became friends that when I was on just getting ready to leave Warner Brothers, I was doing a last project in the hopes that they would pick me up, and Tommy LaPuma said, "You need to go and do these sides with Larry." And that sort of bonded Larry and I, because we spent a month and a half or so working on these sides, and I just drive down to his house every day and stay in LA, and not every day. I'd just drive down to his house, and we would work every day. I remember one of the songs was "She Loves My Car" that I did with Larry, and so when it came time later on, I did this album. I thought, I'm through making records now. I'm a songwriter. I'd moved to Nashville. I'd met Becky. And then I got a call from this guy in Paris. He said, "Bill LaBounty, do you know that you are a star here?" And I laughed because I knew that wasn't true. But he said, "You're a hit." Apparently I had a record there in France that was a hit called "Living It Up." And he told me if I did another album, I would sell a lot of records in France and Europe. So I decided to do another album, but I was my own record company and fundraiser and all of that, which people didn't do as much back then. Today it's nothing because everybody's capable of making a record. People they mix their records on airplanes and stuff now. Well, they're between New York and LA or something. But I decided to do another record, and I was thinking about guitar players. I had some really good guitar on it. Brian Ray, who plays with Paul McCartney now, played guitar on that record too. It wasn't Into Something Blue. It was the first record Larry played on, called The Right Direction. It's an album that came before Into Something Blue. And I called Larry, and I had one or two songs I wanted him to play on. And he showed up with his sound guy and everybody, and he played on the whole record from beginning to end. That really instantly put the record up in a notch that I never could have all by myself. And I recommend the record just because of Larry. And after that, he played on everything I did independently. He didn't play on the whole album, but he would play. I think I followed that with an album called Back to Your Star that Larry's on. And then this last one, Into Something Blue. And Larry played on everything on that record too, because at the time I was going to be managed by Larry's manager. I got Larry on sort of an inside situation. I think he had a great time too. We both had a great time. And Larry moved to Nashville. And also, when Larry goes to Tokyo and plays, or when he used to, Larry's still playing. I think Larry played all the way through the pandemic. But I was going to Tokyo and playing because those independent records that I did were doing well in places like Japan and France, Italy. I never went to Italy, but so I'd go to Tokyo, and a couple times Larry was there at the same time I was. And so he'd have me come and be a special guest at places he was playing. And then I would have Larry be my special guest. The clubs were the Cotton Club, is where I played in Tokyo, and the bottom line was Larry's church, sort of there. So we've been fast friends for quite a few years. You don't always hear from Larry because he might be the hardest working. He might work more than any other musician I know. But
Bill, would you say that there has been a compliment that has meant the most to you through the years as an artist?
Probably, but I can't I'm not sure what that might be. It's funny on the record. Oh, I did a box set. France, it was Wariner France. Wariner and Rhino put out a box set on me. And part of the box set was quotes from people that were close associates creatively with me, like Russ Titleman, Tommy LaPuma. I did records with Larry, and they all said something nice about me. You know, I had to beg them to, but some of them were already quoted, and it wasn't my idea to do that. It was the label. This guy from the label said that would really be cool to just have quotes from all these guys on the box, but I can't I can't remember the quotes, but I'll bet that one of them is probably, I think what Tommy said was really floored me, and I can't remember what he said. So you'll have to look at the box. You can look at, if you look for it, you can go online and find the box probably on Amazon or something. But I think they've been sold out for a long time. You know, they only probably press like, 800 of them or something. But
something I've noticed throughout this interview, your sense of humor seems to be a lot like Don Cook's.
Yeah, I mean, Don Cook is one of my very best friends of all time. Don and I talk almost every day. In fact, when I heard from you, I called Don because I'd seen him doing an interview. Did he do an interview with you that was on computer, or was it on the phone?
He called in. Yeah, it was on the phone.
Okay, but I think I heard some of that.
Oh,
might have been on his Facebook page or something like that. So I knew that, but I didn't know it was you. And somebody told me that Don had talked to you, so I just called and asked about you, and he was very complimentary about you. We're talking to you and you.
Cool. Well, something he said in his interview, whenever I think about him, I always think about this. He talked about moving to Nashville, and he said there was no risk for him. He said, I was a failure where I was from, so I just packed up my failure and moved.
Yeah.
That always makes me laugh.
That's kind of, people, when we were coming to Nashville, you weren't especially proud of it. You just thought, I've always heard it's all about country music, and country music to me, and I'm sure it was to Don too, was always something that was just part of our lives. It was like Wonder Bread or a certain kind of brand of potato chips. It was just not exciting. I was excited by Dylan and rock and all of that stuff, but and it took me a while to realize that all of those things exist within the parameters of country music too. I mean, I didn't really appreciate Hank Williams when I moved here. I didn't know who the Carters were, but after years of living here, those things started meaning more to me. In fact, way back then, I remember there was guys that played acoustic guitars. I would call that elbow music. And I'd say, man, I don't want to do any elbow music. But it's not. That's what I learned. I didn't know there were finger pickers and there was all these wonderful, that country consisted of a hell of a lot more than what may have been on the radio growing up. And I played a lot of country music when I was a kid because I didn't always get where I grew up in the Northwest and Idaho. There weren't always outlets to play rock. There were a few places that strictly you had to learn Merle Haggard and Buck Owens and all of that stuff in order to make a living. So country was always something that was there for me. It was just, it was kind of like a utility that I just took it for granted. And country's like that, isn't it? It's like everybody feels like they identify with it on some level. But I don't know where that level is anymore. The music business now is, it's in a state of flux, I think. But it's gonna land somewhere.
It has to.
Yeah, there are a lot of good things about the internet. That I have nephews who are musicians. I have a nephew who's really a great musician. He lives in Minneapolis, and he's one of those multi-instrumentalists. He plays drums, bass, keyboards, sings. He works with Ricky Peterson, who's this leading keyboard player. What I was going to say is the internet is all about exposure now. You need to get something on YouTube, and there are a lot of independent artists now that wouldn't have existed when I was in the music business, because it was sort of a closed little circle that you'd have to work really hard to get in. Now it's the widest circle in the world. You can drown in the middle of it, you know, but you can find anybody's music on YouTube, and there are things on YouTube that, let's face it, is just incredibly good. And then sometimes the labels pick it up, but it's just so hard to make money.
Yeah.
For somebody old like me, I've learned enough from Pat, my nephew, that if you're young and you're an artist and you're starting out and you don't have any history at all, it's really hard to be exposed in any real meaningful way. Whereas with me, I was doing albums back before anybody was born that people all over Europe, it's like a little peg. It's not a big peg, but when I make a record, it's a little place I can hang my hat, you know, my little album, and I'll get some attention. And I probably should make another record. I'm in the process of it. Got about like half a record made, but it's just so different now. If some label would just come to me and give me $20,000 or something, but right, I can still make records because I have all the things at home that I need to do it. One thing I don't have, though, is the money to recompense the really great instrumental artists like Larry and the people who I know them all, but after a while it just gets embarrassing to call them and ask if they'll come and play on your project. But that's basically where I'm at now, and you can do some good projects that way, and I don't intend to stop.
What would you say is the best thing about being Bill LaBounty?
My wife, probably my daughter. I have a beautiful, incredibly intelligent daughter who lives in Chicago. Went to the University of Chicago, and now she's back at the University of Chicago getting her law degree. And that having a child that you're proud of is really a good thing to have, because you don't have to rely on somebody else really to make you feel good, as long as she'll always make me feel good no matter what she does. I sort of feel the same about my wife. And having been able to have a life in music, doing exactly what I wanted to do, I may not have gotten rich every day from doing it, but it's always exactly what I've ever wanted to do. So not everybody is that lucky. I consider that luck. My dad used to say when I was a teenager, I had this old upright piano and I would bang on it, and he'd come and he hated it, and he'd say, you know, you'll never get anywhere sitting on your butt in front of that thing. And it was always really sad to me because but I don't want to do anything, you know. So I always just thought, well, wherever I get, that's what I'm going to do, Dad.
Well, anybody out there?
I still have that voice in my head. Oh, go ahead.
You said you still have that voice in your head?
Yeah, that's the only problem with that. You have to go to have analysis to get. You have to have behavioral training to get rid of that voice.
Well, anybody out there who is interested, they can go to BillLaBounty.com. It's LABOUNTY. And for those who have been following your music, whether they're in Japan or France or here in the US of A, is there anything in closing you would like to say before we go?
Well, I feel really grateful for my audience. It's a modest audience. I don't think my audience would want to be thought of as a big audience. And I'm just grateful to have an audience at this stage in my life who might care about the music that I want to make, because I'm still making it and fully intend to continue. And so I guess it's thank you. Thank you for being there.
And Bill, thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
Thank you for this interview.
Thank you, Paul. I had a great time.
All right, sir. Well, I look forward to the next album of yours. We'll be listening.
Yeah. Well, you'll be among the first to know about it.
Beautiful. All right, sir. Well, until next time.
All right. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Ba 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 da beep ba boop da boop da beep ba da leap ba knock da bees I walk on to sugar get it no it is in gaga kiss I got is it I'm swagging I believe it's a good but don't take a walk again goodbye.